Last week was an amazing introduction for the second half of this inaugural season of God of High School, and this week's episode picked up and got crazy. There was so much amazing stuff in this episode, but just like every adaptation, some things were skipped, so I'll be going over everything the anime misses to give you guys a fuller understanding of the story. God of High School Episode 7 Anima/Force, covering chapters 46 through 55. So just starting out, there was some stuff missing in chapter 46, and that primarily builds on the stuff that was skipped from chapter 45 in last week's episode. This is the whole encounter between Punkwang, Mori, and Haoyang. Just as a reminder to those of you that may have forgotten, Haoyang is a 6th member, the one with purple hair, and he's also the leader of the homeless group. To briefly recap the interaction, Haoyang was homeless and he was asking Mori for money. Mori thought it would be suitable to give him like $1 or so, but suddenly Haoyang stole $50 from Mori's wallet. Mori tried his hardest to get the stolen money back, but with Haoyang being a 6th member, it was pretty obvious that he wasn't able to keep up with him. Another important thing that happened in this interaction is Mori used his acupuncture technique and poked Haoyang, but it had no effect. I think the purpose of this in the webtoon is to show readers that although Mori may be learning some hacks techniques, they won't work on someone who's still vastly stronger than him. Anyway, back to the anime, we get the pre-opening scene and it's actually an anime-only scene. This scene didn't really go over too much, it was just Mubong's discussion with Daiwe about the God of High School tournament, the purpose of it, and what it's really about. And if you watched last week's episode, you'll notice something familiar. It's because this scene takes clips and segments from last week's episode and puts them together for a brief 15-second or so introduction. After the opening, we get the real start of the episode. This is when the new judge explains the rules of the tournament, saying how it's teams of 3, but they'll be fighting in one-on-one matches. The explanation in the webtoon is the same as it was in the anime. After the rules are explained, the first fight is announced and it's between Mori and Gadong, and this is where some of the differences start. The first difference is Mori poking himself. In this episode, Mori poked himself, saying that it would boost his power and he would be able to defeat Gadong very quickly. But in the webtoon, Mori had a different reason for poking himself. It was actually a complete accident. After poking Haoyang in the scene that I talked about a bit earlier in the video, Mori poked himself in the same place because he thought his technique didn't work. But unfortunately for Mori, when the match started, he paralyzed himself. So Mori realized that his acupuncture did work, but Haoyang was just too strong to use it on. And yet again, like most of the differences, this difference really isn't that big of a deal. The execution was slightly different in the webtoon, but they both serve the same purpose of Mori being incapacitated for his first match. Besides this, I also noticed some little differences in portrayal between the webtoon and the anime. The first is that in the webtoon, Mori is a lot more serious, and the reason is because he's been informed that his grandfather Taijin is in trouble. After learning of his grandfather's situation, Mori resolved to himself to win the God of High School tournament to seek help and gather information to potentially save his grandfather. Because of this serious shift and the things with his grandfather, he has more of an edge in the webtoon and he really wants to get things done quickly and wants to stop messing around in the tournament. But obviously in the anime, Mori doesn't really know what's going on with his grandfather, so this kind of tension and tonal shift wouldn't make sense. Either way, we have the same result of him losing his first match to Gadong. Now the next fight in the webtoon was actually completely cut from the anime, but it wasn't a really big fight, it was just a skirmish between Daiwe and Gadong. According to the rules of the tournament, fighters can stay and fight another match if they wish, so in the webtoon, Gadong wanted to go another round against Team Seoul where he fought Daiwe. But unfortunately for Gadong, he was ultimately outmatched like the rest of his team as Daiwe completely annihilated him. Overall, this fight was only around 7 panels or so it kind of makes sense as to why it was cut from the anime, but I think that they really could have fit it in if they wanted to. The next scene in the anime rolls over into chapter 47 of the webtoon. This is where Punkwang and Daiwe start to face off. But before I get into the differences within the fight between Punkwang and Daiwe, a whole part of Punkwang's flashback is actually skipped, and this flashback developed the relationship between Gadong and Punkwang. A flashback in the webtoon showed Punkwang's life as a teenager. Growing up, he was a delinquent, almost like Gadong was before they met. He really didn't take his life or school seriously, and his father was always seen getting mad at him because his dad was a delinquent growing up too, and he didn't want his son to end up the same way that he did. Pumkwang didn't take his father's request seriously at this time, so he just ignored him and still didn't take school seriously. And since he was just messing around his whole life, he ended up becoming a day laborer. Although he was already an adult at that time and still didn't have a high school degree, he decided that it wasn't too late, so he decided to study hard in order to get back into high school. During this time is where he met Gadong. He saw a lot of himself in Gadong as he was kind of like a delinquent, just in the same way Pumkwang was when he was younger. So he decided to take Gadong under his wing and set him along the right path. And with that heartfelt interaction, that was the end of the flashback in chapter 47. Again, I understand why the anime would want to cut this fight to save time for more important stuff in the season, because although it was a pretty heartfelt flashback and it allows us to understand the relationship between the team more, this team is ultimately fodder just to serve as Seoul's first win, and they don't really serve a purpose in the rest of the series. Going back to the anime, the fight between Pumkwang and Daiwe starts, but it's quickly interrupted by Q versus McDonald. This fight rolls over into chapter 48. This segment of the fight between Q and McDonald was pretty similar in both the webtoon and the anime versions, but the main difference is that the anime segment was a lot shorter than it was in the webtoon. In the episode, the length of the scene is from Q being impaled to taking off his limiter and summoning his Chariot the Joker. But in the webtoon, we get everything that led up to Q being impaled, as well as all the stuff with him taking his limiter off and summoning his Chariot. So we get to see everything from McDonald breaking into Q's apartment, how the fight started, their first conversations and interaction. And frankly, this is one of the things that I don't like that was cut from this anime episode. I really don't know why it wasn't included. It would probably only add another 12 more seconds or so if they did it properly. But anyway, since this segment of the fight was a lot longer in the webtoon, this ended up covering all of chapter 48. The anime switches back to Daiwe and Pumkwang, but their fight is cut off by yet another flashback, and in this case, it's Zhongmi's relationship with Pumkwang. This is the only flashback that we got of the team in this episode, and it's pulled from chapter 52 of the webtoon. The only difference is that in the webtoon, this flashback was shown during the fight between Zhongmi and Mira as she's remembering her time with Pumkwang. If I were to describe the flashback in the anime in any way, I would say bland and kind of nonsensical. You'll see what I mean when I describe how it went in the webtoon, because it just made a lot more sense there and it seemed a lot less forced than it did in the anime. So in the anime, Zhongmi saw Pumkwang as a construction worker, and she simply just thought to herself that she would never be a failure in life in the same way that she assumed Pumkwang was. Later that day, Zhongmi lost a fencing match and it really tore her up. It kind of seemed like she was saying it was the end of the world and she saw herself as a failure in life like she saw a construction worker. And it really didn't make sense why Zhongmi would have such a big reaction just for losing one match in an extracurricular that she does for fun. But anyway, as Zhongmi's throwing her temper tantrum and after she broke her sword, Pumkwang shows up and gives her some encouragement and repairs it for her. Seeing the kindness, the next day Zhongmi decides to help him study for the entrance exam. The webtoon flashback hit the same points, but it had a very different and, in my opinion, better execution. It started with Zhongmi fencing and she brings lunch to her dad, who's a construction worker. This is where we see Pumkwang in the story. Zhongmi's dad and Pumkwang are actually friends at the construction site, and her dad tells her to help Pumkwang with a problem. She ends up telling him the answer to that problem, but she really doesn't think that he'll understand it. The next day, Pumkwang and Zhongmi meet each other again on the way to the school. Zhongmi's there for a big fencing match, while Pumkwang's there to take the entrance exam. They get separated momentarily because Pumkwang wants to help an old man carry something for him. And as they get separated, Zhongmi gets attacked by a rival using an iron sword. And no, it's not an actual iron sword, it's a wooden sword that has an iron beam inside so that it's really heavy and can do a lot of serious damage. During the scuffle, she ends up hurting Zhongmi's wrist, but before she does any major damage, Pumkwang reappears to block the sword. And even though Zhongmi wasn't majorly injured, she ended up losing her match due to the injury she received on her wrist. And if that wasn't bad enough, Pumkwang was also not able to take the entrance exam because he was being questioned by the police. The girl that attacked Zhongmi roughened herself up and told the police that Pumpkwing was the one that hurt her. After some questioning, they quickly realized that the girl was lying, but this still meant that Pumpkwing wasn't able to take the test that day. Over the next couple days, Zhongmi learned about the situation and started helping Pumpkwing over the next couple weeks study for his entrance exam. He ended up passing and they started becoming pretty close friends. After the flashback, we go back to the fight between Daiwe and Pumpkwing and the commissioner's fight with Nox. This segment of the anime actually covers all of chapter 49, but it's reversed. First in the anime, we get the end of the fight between Daiwe and Pumpkwing, in which Pumpkwing uses his Thor's hammer chariot, but Daiwe is able to easily counter it using his 4th dragon stance. The second scene in the anime shows the next part of Q's fight, where Saturn and Exley show up to save McDonald from getting killed by Q, and it ends when O shows up to save Q from Saturn and Exley. The webtoon is all pretty much the same, but it's reversed, as it starts out with the commissioner's fight with Nox and ends with Daiwe and Pumpkwing's fight. But there was one more tiny change in the anime, and this was in Daiwe and Pumpkwing's fight. In the webtoon, when Pumpkwing used his Thor's hammer to strike Daiwe and Daiwe was able to block it, it wasn't just his pure strength, he actually called upon his chariot. It was just a sneak peek of Daiwe's chariot, as it didn't really take shape yet, it was more of just a blue ball surrounding him. In the anime, it was implied that Daiwe was able to just block it based on his own strength, and yet again, it's probably just because they're saving the reveal of Daiwe's chariot for a future fight. The next portion of the anime shows Zhongmi versus Mira, and the end of the fight between Nox and the commissioners, which adapts chapters 51 through 54. It's a pretty much one-to-one adaptation from the webtoon besides the ordering. Although I do have to say that the fight between Nox and the commissioners was actually a lot better in the anime. It just looked a lot cooler, probably since the art was updated as the webtoon chapter got released a couple years ago at this point. And also just the fact that we got to see all of the cool colors flashing and everything just happening in motion. The anime also better conveyed that the fights were going on simultaneously, because in the webtoon, chapters 51 and 52 were the fight between Nox and the commissioners, while chapters 53 and 54 were Zhongmi versus Mira. They were completely separated, which kind of implies that the fights weren't going on at the same time. In the anime, the fights were interwoven with one another, which makes it very apparent to the viewers that the fights are occurring simultaneously. Even though this was a good change in theory, I kind of think that it was better when the fight with Nox was before the fight with Zhongmi and Mira. Because at least for me, every time I saw Zhongmi and Mira fighting, I was kind of disappointed and I just wanted to get back to the fight between O, Q, and Nox. Though that's just a nitpick, some of you might disagree with that stance, but honestly, I just thought that fight was a lot more entertaining than the fight between Zhongmi and Mira. And chapter 55 covers the brutal rest of episode 7. There was still a few differences, but they really weren't that big of a deal. The first being Jugok's chariot is very apparent in the webtoon. We see that it's flying behind him, and it's also depicted to be a worse version of his grandfather. Besides this, the obliteration of Jugok was completely the same. Also, the interaction between Daiwe and Jagal hyped up Jagal even more in the webtoon. In the anime, Daiwe just kicked him once and they ended up separating, but in the webtoon, the scuffle continued a bit more as Jagal got one punch off on Daiwe. Jagal messed up the punch and barely grazed him, but when Daiwe was walking away, he still noted how powerful the attack was, and if he fully connected, he might have been knocked out on the spot. And with that last change, that's the end of chapter 55 and episode 7 of the anime. The episode was great and not too much was skipped. It was a really solid adaptation of the source material and I really enjoyed it. If you guys have any suggestions, leave it in the comments and don't forget to like,